In November 1910, a group of America's wealthiest and most powerful men met in secret on a secluded island. Their mission was not to govern or legislate, but to create a banking system that would change the course of American history forever. Little did the public know that this meeting laid the groundwork for the enslavement of the entire country through national debt. And it all began on Jekyll Island. 6 men boarded a private train under false identities, bound for a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. Their names were Nelson Aldrich, Abraham Piatt Andrew, Frank Vanderlip, Henry Davison, Benjamin Strong, and Paul Warburg. Each of these men wielded enormous power. Aldrich, the senator who controlled the nation's monetary policy. Vanderlip, head of what would become Citibank. Davison, representing J.P. Morgan's interests. Warburg, a successful German-born financier who was a partner at the investment bank Kuhn, Loeb & Co. Together, they represented the wealthiest banks in America. This was no ordinary meeting. These men had been called together by Aldrich to secretly design a new central banking system. They would later present it as a way to stabilize the economy, but in reality, it was designed to give private banks immense power over the nation's money supply. At the time, America had faced repeated financial crises, bank runs, and instability. The public demanded reform, but Aldrich and his associates had a different agenda, one that would benefit the banks more than the people. Their plan: the creation of a central bank that could print money, control interest rates, and lend to the government. They called it the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act was written in secret, away from public scrutiny. For 3 years, the plan was carefully hidden, and when it was finally ready to be passed, Aldrich and his allies worked quickly to push it through. In a particularly shady move, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress had already left for the holidays. With very few representatives present, the act slipped through quietly, ensuring that the public wouldn't have a chance to fully understand what had just happened. President Woodrow Wilson signed the act into law, and with it, the Federal Reserve was born. Wilson would later regret his decision, writing that he had unwittingly ruined his country. But by then, it was too late. The creature had been unleashed.
Jekyll Island, what is the Federal Reserve and what is your answer?
Well, what it is, it's a cartel. It's not a government agency. It has the appearance of it being a government agency, and they went to great lengths to give it that facade. It does have the power of government because Congress voted to give the power of enforcement to it. But in its essence, underneath it, it's a cartel. It's nothing different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. They got together, they drew up the rules and regulations for their own industry, to self-regulate their own industry is what cartels do, and then they sent it to Congress, and they took off the label at the top that said banking cartel, and they erased that, and they said Federal Reserve Act. Congress passed it into law, and that's why we think it's a government agency, is because if you don't obey the rules that they set down for their own industry, you go to prison. And so it looks like a government agency. But basically the answer to your question is, it's a banking cartel.
The Federal Reserve was created to stabilize the economy, but its true effect has been the exact opposite. Instead of reducing debt and crises, it allowed the U.S. government to borrow more than ever before. Over the next century, the national debt exploded, climbing into the trillions. The Federal Reserve System works like this. The government borrows money from the Fed, which is created out of thin air. But it doesn't come for free. The government has to pay interest on every dollar borrowed. And where does that interest come from? Taxes. Your taxes. The result? Every American is on the hook for a debt they never consented to. The more the government borrows, the more we pay in taxes, the more our currency is inflated, and the more we become trapped in a system that only benefits the wealthy elite.
Inflation is made in Washington because only Washington can create money. And any other attribution to other groups of inflation is wrong. Consumers don't produce it. Producers don't produce it. The trade unions don't produce it. Foreign sheiks don't produce it. Oil imports don't produce it. What produces it is too much government spending and too much government creation of money and nothing else.
For decades, politicians have promised to reduce the national debt. But the truth is, they have very little control.
Can you give me a rather quick answer on this? Do you have any idea what percentage the base should shrink or might shrink? Or is that something that you don't even want to address?
No, I think we would like to bring the balance sheet back to something consistent with where it was before the crisis, which means enough to accommodate Americans' demand for currency, plus a modest amount of reserves in the banking system. And that would suggest something under $1 trillion, I think, would be
$1 trillion?
Or less, yes.
Okay.
The real power lies with the Federal Reserve, an institution which was designed to operate independently of the government. This means that, while politicians come and go, the bankers who control the Fed remain in power, manipulating the economy from behind the scenes. These unelected officials, people you've never voted for, control the money supply, set interest rates, and dictate the value of the dollar. The system was created to give the illusion of democratic control, but in reality, the reins of power are held by private bankers.
As I said before, keep your eye on one thing and one thing only, how much government is spending, because that's the true tax. Every budget is balanced. There is no such thing as an unbalanced federal budget. You're paying for it. If you're not paying for it through it in the form of explicit taxes, you're paying for it indirectly in the form of inflation or in the form of borrowing. The thing you should keep your eye on is what government spends. And the real problem is to hold down government spending as a fraction of our income. And if you do that, you can stop worrying about the debt.
Here's how the trap works. The government borrows from the Federal Reserve to fund wars, welfare programs, and infrastructure. But that money isn't free. It comes with interest. To pay off that interest, the government borrows even more, plunging deeper into debt. Meanwhile, wages stagnate, inflation rises, and the cost of living increases. Americans are forced to work harder just to stay afloat, all while the national debt spirals out of control. And the more debt the government accumulates, the weaker the value of the dollar becomes.
This is what happens when you have a quantity of something and then you add more to it. This is dilution. The principle is so simple that a child can understand, and you can create this little science project at home. The principle is called dilution. And when you print $5 trillion and you put it into the economy, you have diluted the value of the money. So for instance, if you had a minimum wage at some amount, and somebody was making minimum wage, and they were still making minimum wage after this money was printed, they actually are making considerably less in terms of real dollars. It's dilution.
But is there a way out? Some believe that reforming the Federal Reserve, or even abolishing it altogether, is the only way to break free from this debt trap. Others argue for a return to the gold standard, a system that would limit how much money the government could borrow.
If we could make you dictator, would you abolish the Fed?
Yes.
You would?
Yes. I mean, for the reasons I just gave, the history. There's no, the Fed represented wonderful hopes, but we've had so many programs that represented wonderful hopes that ended in disaster. I don't doubt that someone who is sufficiently scholarly could come up with examples of where the Federal Reserve made things better. The question is, overall, what was it supposed to do? It was supposed to do not only prevent bank failures, it was supposed to prevent huge changes in the money supply, in particular, great deflations.
Right.
The greatest deflation in American history occurred under the Federal Reserve System.
The decisions made over a century ago on Jekyll Island still haunt us today. The national debt is not just a number. It's a burden on every American citizen. As long as the Federal Reserve exists in its current form, the cycle of debt will continue, and the American people will remain enslaved by a system that serves the few at the expense of the many. The creature from Jekyll Island was born in secrecy, but its effects are felt by all of us. The question is, will we ever be able to tame it?
So who's financing the government? Government is financed by treasury bonds, paper. And who buys the treasury bonds? Mostly the Fed. And how does the Fed buy them? By printing money. But what backing does the Fed have for that money being printed? The treasury bonds themselves. So basically, you finance the government by printing money out of thin air.
Bitcoin!
Someone could ask, well, so if the government can print the limited amounts of money out of thin air, why do they collect taxes?
If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe for more videos like this one.